My 6-year-old niece called me on a stormy night, her voice trembling through the static. I'm locked in, starving. Please help, Uncle. My hands shook as I grabbed my keys, racing into the rain toward my parents' house, the place she was supposed to be safe. But when I opened that door, what I found made my blood boil. And then, I'm Silas Kane, and this is the most painful truth I've ever had to speak out loud. I never imagined my own family could be capable of this. I'm about to share everything with you, raw and unfiltered. Before I share my story, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple hi in the comments or let me know where you're watching from. I love to see how far my story can reach. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. And please, if my story touches you, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support means the world. It helps me keep telling stories that need to be heard, stories of truth, pain, and survival. The phone rang just before midnight, its vibration cutting through the steady hum of rain against my apartment windows. I glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number from Salem. Normally I'd let it go to voicemail, but something inside me told me to answer. The voice on the other end was thin, trembling, a whisper swallowed by static and thunder. Uncle Silas, I'm locked in a room. I'm so hungry. Please help me. Then the line went dead. My chest tightened. I called back immediately, but the call didn't connect. I tried again, nothing. I dialed my parents' house where my niece Ivy had been living since my brother vanished from her life. No answer. I tried my mother's cell, then my father's. Straight to voicemail each time. The silence was louder than the storm outside. I grabbed my truck keys with shaking hands, pulling on an old raincoat and stuffing a flashlight and first aid kit into a bag. The air outside was heavy with electricity, the kind of storm that made the streets look like rivers under the lightning's glare. Tires skidded on wet asphalt as I barreled down I-5, every mile a war against the pounding rain and my own spiraling thoughts. Why would Ivy be locked in a room? Why hadn't I listened to my gut sooner when I noticed the shadows under her eyes and how she clung to that ragged stuffed bear of hers? I should have known. By the time I pulled into the quiet cul-de-sac outside my parents' house in Salem, my heartbeat was louder than the thunder. The house sat there in darkness, shutters rattling in the wind. Too quiet, too perfect on the outside. The lawn neatly trimmed, the white fence glistening with rain. A mask of order hiding rot. The front door was locked tight, no lights inside. I circled to the back, my flashlight catching on the glint of raindrops. The kitchen window was jammed but brittle with age. I pressed my shoulder against the frame until the glass gave way, shattering in a muted crash under the roar of the storm. Shards crunched beneath my boots as I pulled myself into the cold silence of the house. The air reeked faintly of mildew. I crept through the hallway, every creak of the floorboards amplified. My light caught on a narrow door at the end of the hall. The wooden frame bore scratches where a latch had been forced shut from the outside. My stomach turned. I unhooked the lock, swung the door open, and there she was. Ivy sat curled in the corner on a thin blanket, a stuffed bear clutched tight to her chest. Her face was pale cheeks, sunken eyes wide and hollow. A plate with a few broken crackers sat beside her. Her lips trembled as she looked up at me, and then she was in my arms, fragile as a bird. "Uncle," she whispered, her voice breaking. I wrapped her in my raincoat, my own breath unsteady as I snapped photos of the room, the latch, the crumbs, anything that might prove what I was seeing. Then I carried her out into the storm. As I drove back toward Salem's ER, Ivy, dozing weakly against me, my mind wouldn't stop replaying the sight of that room. Why would my parents lock her in there? Why had they left her alone? The questions ripped at me as hard as the rain on my windshield. On the passenger seat, her stuffed bear lay limp damp from her tears. I noticed a small plastic bowl abandoned by the door of the storage room, streaked with what looked like dried seasoning instant noodles maybe. And on the desk in the hallway, a calendar with evening dates crossed out in red ink. Patterns, signs of absence. My blood ran cold. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. The ER lights felt too bright, too sterile against the storm I'd just pulled Ivy out of. Nurses rushed forward as soon as they saw me carrying her, their expressions hardening at the sight of her thin frame. Dr. Nora Patel, a pediatrician on call, guided me into an exam room. I laid Ivy down my hands, reluctant to let go. Blood pressure, temperature, blood work. Everything was logged with brisk precision. Dr. Patel's face tightened as the numbers came in. Malnutrition, severe vitamin deficiencies, chronic neglect. She explained in calm, steady words that Ivy would need to be admitted for monitoring and long-term care. My chest ached with every phrase. I signed the forms agreeing to temporary guardianship, while trying not to let Ivy see the guilt tearing me apart. When Dr. Patel asked about her guardians, I told her the truth. I couldn't reach them. My parents hadn't answered a single call. She frowned, noting it in the file, and said a mandatory report would be filed with Child Protective Services. For the first time, it felt real. This wasn't just my private horror, it was now a case. Evidence, paperwork, investigations. I handed over the photos I'd taken at the house, every detail I could recall. The scratched latch on the storage door, the bowl with its salt-stained residue, the crossed-out evenings on the calendar. Dr. Patel nodded grimly, telling me these details would matter. Later, when Ivy stirred, I held her hand. Her fingers were cold, but she clung to me. In a whisper barely audible, she said, "I didn't know how to call you. I don't know your number." "A lady." She gave me the phone. My head snapped toward her. "What lady?" Ivy's eyes flickered, uncertain. She had a dark raincoat. She pushed the phone through the door with a note. It said, "Call Uncle Silas." My breath caught. Someone else had been there. Someone who knew what was happening inside that house and decided to intervene. A stranger in the storm, watching from the shadows, slipping Ivy the lifeline that saved her. Who was she? Why did she know to call me? As Ivy drifted back to sleep, my mind raced. I scribbled a to-do list in the small notebook I carried. Check neighborhood cameras, ask Esther across the street. Pull cell tower data from the call dig into my parents' whereabouts that night. Where had they gone while Ivy sat locked away in the dark? Who was the woman in the rain? Guilt pressed heavy on me, but so did resolve. I couldn't undo the years I'd been too distracted to notice what was happening. But now, I could fight. Ivy deserved more than survival. She deserved truth and safety and a future not defined by neglect. As the storm continued to rage outside the hospital windows, I realized this night was only the beginning. The house in Salem had given me more questions than answers, and the woman in the dark raincoat had opened a door I couldn't ignore. Tomorrow I would return. I had to. I went back to Salem the next morning with the kind of focus that comes after a sleepless night. The storm had wrung the neighborhood dry. Leaves clung to the white fence like bruises. I unlocked the back door I'd forced open and stepped into the same stale quiet, my phone ready to document everything I should have seen sooner. In the study, my father's desk sat like a stage-set blotter, square pens aligned, a framed family photo aimed straight at the door, as if to greet any visitor with a smile that no longer meant anything. Inside the top drawer, I found envelopes from the bank with monthly memos labeled Ivy's allowance in my mother's tidy cursive. The deposits matched the amount I'd heard them mention, a stipend meant for Ivy's care. Yet the receipts paper-clipped behind each envelope told a different story. A new set of audiophile speakers, a tasting menu at a downtown restaurant, 2 orchestra tickets for a weekend I remembered Ivy missing school. I photographed every page, date, and total. A leather-bound planner sat in the lower drawer. Pages were filled with dinner parties, gallery nights, and social commitments, many in the evenings. The same evenings crossed off on the hallway calendar. Next to a Saturday entry was a small star and the word late. I pressed my palm onto the paper to steady my breath and kept going. Esther opened her door on the second knock. She wore a faded sweater and the kind of gaze that has kept a quiet count of wrongs over the years. We spoke in her living room while the heater ticked. She said she often heard crying late at night, thin and muffled, and saw my parents leaving, dressed up, the porch lights set on a timer that clicked on at the same minute every evening. Once she woke to the sound of rain and saw a woman in a dark raincoat standing beneath the eaves across my parents' back steps, motionless, looking toward the kitchen door. I thought she might be waiting for someone, Esther said, but the house stayed dark. She wrote down what she remembered. I snapped a photo of her note along with the time-stamped snapshot she'd taken months ago of my parents heading out in formal wear. From there I drove to Ivy's elementary school. The secretary led me to a small conference room where Clara Reed, a young teacher with calm eyes, had a folder ready. Attendance log showed a pattern of starts and abrupt stops, Ivy present for a day or two, then absent for a week. Behavioral notes described lethargy and hunger. Staff had tried calling the listed guardians again and again with no reply. Clara told me she'd sent emails that bounced back or went unanswered. I asked if the school could prepare a formal letter about educational neglect and the attempts to contact my parents. She nodded and promised to send one by day's end. When she said Ivy often arrived clutching her worn stuffed bear and asking for just a snack, please, I had to look away to keep my voice from breaking. I returned to the house with a list of places I hadn't checked. The hallway closet held little besides a vacuum and neatly folded linens. In the study again, I crouched to check the file cabinet. An almost invisible keyhole winked from the back panel of the lowest drawer. I found the key taped under the desk drawer runner, the kind of trick you learn from watching a man who hides whiskey in the garage rafters and insists he doesn't drink. The lock gave with a soft click. Inside lay a thin folder labeled IVK in my father's handwriting. My mouth went dry. The folder held a photocopy of a trust document titled IVV Kane, with Freya's name in the grantor line dated years back, and a stapled packet behind it, a draft petition to assume management of a minor's trust by a legal guardian. The draft was partially filled in my mother's name, typed neatly beside proposed guardian. My father's contact information clipped to the front, but the signature lines were blank, flagged with yellow sticky notes that read, "Sign and notarize and submit with letters." Tucked behind those forms were printouts of bank balances and quarterly statements that didn't belong to any account I knew. I photographed each page, every reference number, every address line, and kept digging until I was sure I had everything. I called the HOA office on the drive back to the hospital. The manager said the neighborhood didn't maintain shared security cameras. Only individual homes had doorbells with recording, and my parents had never opted in. He was willing to confirm in writing the neighborhood's general policies and the dates of community events that matched the planner entries. Another thread for the file. Back at the ER, I showed Dr. Battelle the documents and told her what Esther and Clara had said. She reminded me to keep my focus feed. Ivy, keep her warm. Let the professionals record the rest. I stood at the foot of Ivy's bed and watched the slow rise and fall of her chest, the cuff on her arm printing out proof that she was still here. When she woke, she asked for water and a cracker, then told me she didn't like the house when it got quiet at night, because quiet means I'm not allowed to come out. I wrote it down word for word. Every sentence felt like a stone in my pocket, heavy, undeniable, something I would carry into whatever came next. That night, at the kitchen table in my apartment with papers spread out under the lamplight, I built a timeline. Allowance deposits, luxury purchases, party dates, school absences, medical findings, the locked room, the woman in the rain, and now this, a dormant trust with my niece's name on it, and a ready-made path for my parents to seize control. The pattern stopped being a suspicion and became a map. I texted a single line to a number a friend had given me earlier that day, a family attorney in Portland named Harper Quinn. I need help, I wrote. It's about my niece. I didn't sleep, but the night changed. It shifted from helplessness to intent. The next morning I would put these pages on a lawyer's desk and say the words out loud. It wasn't just neglect. It was a plan. Harper's office sat above a coffee shop that smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar. She had a court-calm voice and an efficient way of arranging paper that made chaos look solvable. I laid out everything: the photos of the storage room, the bowl with its salted crust, the calendar, the receipts tied to Ivy's allowance, Esther's written account, Clara's attendance logs, the preliminary medical report. At the end, I slid across the trust file and waited. "This isn't only a child welfare issue," Harper said after a long silence. "This is financial misconduct woven through a pattern of neglect." She asked for permission to contact the hospital social worker and the school to formalize statements. I agreed and signed what she put in front of me. When she examined the trust folder, she paused at the draft petition. She ran her finger along the footer where a template vendor's name sat in small type. Look at the date in the metadata tag, she said, turning the sheet so I could see the microprint. This draft was generated recently, not years ago. My stomach flipped. She requested any documents I had with Orion's signature for comparison. I pulled up a scanned lease agreement and an old birthday card Orion had signed with a messy flourish back when we still believed life would be simple. Harper compared strokes and pressure on a sample signature that had been printed and traced on a photocopied page tucked in the folder. "This isn't your brother's hand," she said. "Someone tried to approximate it." By midday, Harper had coordinated with Dr. Patel, who agreed to provide a detailed medical statement outlining Ivy's malnutrition and the signs consistent with prolonged neglect. Esther would sign a sworn declaration about the late-night crying and the timed porch light. Clara planned to send a letter about school attendance, documented outreach attempts, and the times Ivy appeared hungry and exhausted. Harper said we would seek emergency temporary custody and that the trust materials would be secured under a preservation notice to prevent tampering. That afternoon, a lawyer representing my parents called Harper. He insisted I had broken into the house and stolen private records, that I was staging a campaign to smear respectable grandparents who had done their best. He hinted they would file a police report for trespass and demand the immediate return of all documents. Harper remained cool. She acknowledged the entry, explained the exigent circumstances and the medical emergency, and pointed out that the materials I possessed pertained directly to the welfare of a minor and potential exploitation. She asked the opposing counsel to preserve any and all communications referencing the trust, the allowance, and my brother, including emails sent from home IP addresses. The line went quiet for a beat. We sat with the door closed as Harper organized the motion packet. "They'll push back," she said, "and they'll present something that looks legitimate to confuse the court." Her prediction landed sooner than I expected. An hour later, an email arrived from opposing counsel attaching a typed letter ostensibly from Orion stating that he had asked his parents to look after Ivy and manage her property. The letter was undated, the salutation generic, the sign-off too neat for a man whose signatures had always carried a hurried slant. Harper printed it, then placed it beside the trust draft. "Same font," she said quietly. "Same spacing quirks. Whoever produced one likely produced the other." That evening at the hospital, I told Dr. Patel what was happening and asked Ivy how she was feeling. She said the Jell-O was her favorite because it was cold and not scary. When she finished a few bites, her eyelids grew heavy. Clara's letter arrived on my phone. The language was clinical and devastating. It spelled out months of absence, unreturned calls, and notes that Ivy asked for food at drop-off. I forwarded it to Harper and thanked Clara. A few minutes later, Esther texted to say she would stand in front of a judge if it came to that. Before I left, Ivy tugged my sleeve and whispered something I will hear for the rest of my life. If I tell on them, she said, eyes on the blanket, they locked the door again. I told her she wouldn't be locked in any more rooms. I told her we were going to make sure of it, not with promises, but with people and paper that had to be obeyed. On my way out of the hospital, rain started again, gentle this time, like a reminder. Harper called as I reached the truck. She had filed for emergency custody and a temporary restraining order preventing my parents from contacting Ivy or accessing any of her accounts. A hearing was set on short notice. "Bring everything tomorrow," she said. "We'll put it in front of a judge and let the facts do what facts do." I parked outside my parents' house one last time that night, not to go in, but to see it for what it was. The porch light blinked on at the exact minute Esther had described, the timing precise and unnerving. No movement inside. I thought of the woman in the raincoat, the hand sliding a phone and a note under a door to reach a child no one else was seeing. Somewhere someone had decided that staying silent was worse than getting involved. That choice had started everything. Back in Portland, I spread the documents on my kitchen table again, the lamplight turning the paper cream and the ink nearly blue. I placed the forged letter in the center, flanked by the school's letter, the medical report, the allowance receipts, the trust draft with its sticky notes, and my photos from the locked room. The pattern wasn't just a map anymore. It was a case. Tomorrow I would walk into court and name what my parents had done. I would call it by its real name and ask the law to do what family had failed to do, protect a child. Esther called me 2 days later, her voice quick with urgency. She'd been cleaning out a drawer and found an old receipt where she had scribbled down a license plate number. It belonged to a car she remembered seeing outside my parents' house the night of the storm, parked half hidden under the dripping trees. She handed me the slip of paper when I stopped by. The numbers were smudged but legible. I drove straight to the DMV office, my hands tapping the counter as the clerk searched. The car was registered to Marjorie Collins, a retired nurse who once worked at Salem General. Her address wasn't far, a small house tucked behind a garden overgrown with lavender and weeds. When she opened the door, I saw a woman in her 60s with kind but guarded eyes. At first she denied knowing anything about that night, shaking her head saying she didn't want trouble. But when I mentioned Freya, my brother's late wife, her face softened. She stepped aside and let me in. We sat at her kitchen table, the smell of chamomile tea steeping between us. She confessed she had been friends with Freya back when Ivy was a baby. Freya asked me once, Marjorie said quietly, that if something ever happened to her, would I keep an eye out for Ivy. I promised I would. After Freya's accident, she hadn't seen Ivy much, but on stormy nights, she sometimes walked past the house. That night, when she saw the place dark, she had a feeling something was wrong. She'd slipped an old phone through the door of the storage room with a note that said, "Call Uncle Silas." That simple act had saved Ivy. Then she reached into a folder and pulled out another document. "I never wanted to get in the middle of family matters," she said, "but Freya gave me this copy years ago, just in case." My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It was Freya's personal will, witnessed and notarized, clearly stating that if Orion was unable to care for Ivy, guardianship was to pass to me. The words burned into me like fire. I had been meant to protect Ivy all along. I brought the document straight to Harper. She studied it line by line, confirmed the notarization was valid, and explained its weight in court. "This changes everything," she said. "Your parents were never the rightful choice." Relief mingled with anger inside me, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe, thinking perhaps we finally had something solid enough to end this nightmare. But Marjorie wasn't done. As I was leaving, she touched my sleeve and whispered, "I saw him." A few months back at a gas station off the highway. Orion. He looked thin, worn down, but alive. He seemed like he didn't want to be recognized. I didn't approach him. The words struck me harder than the storm that night. My brother was alive. He wasn't missing in some far-off abyss. He was out there running, hiding, maybe drowning in his own mistakes. My parents had sworn they hadn't heard from him. Had they lied to me? Had they hidden him away to keep Ivy close, to hold on to money and control? The thought sickened me. That evening, I sat in my truck outside the hospital, staring at the steering wheel. I had Freya's will in one hand, the ghost of Orion in the other. Ivy's fragile breaths echoed in my mind. For the first time, I felt the ground shifting beneath me in two directions at once: hope and dread, salvation and betrayal. I didn't know which would surface first. The courthouse smelled of varnish and old paper, its walls heavy with the weight of other families' broken stories. Ours was about to join them. When I stepped inside with Harper, I saw my parents seated at the far table, their lawyer whispering in their ears. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her lips trembling like she was the victim. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, his posture rigid. The hearing began with their attorney painting me as a reckless bachelor trying to snatch a child for financial gain. He described me as unstable, impulsive, incapable of raising a girl alone. My parents nodded solemnly, their expressions rehearsed. I clenched my fists under the table. Harper rose, steady and sharp. She laid out Ivy's medical records first. "Doctor." Patel took the stand, her testimony cutting through the room with clinical precision. She spoke of malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, the evidence of prolonged neglect. Each word was a blade, and I saw my father flinch as if struck. Next came the financial trail. Harper presented the receipts, the bank envelopes, the luxury purchases tied to Ivy's allowance. I watched the judge's brow tighten as Harper stacked one contradiction after another. When she laid out the forged petition with Orion's signature, the courtroom murmured. Then came the surprise I hadn't fully anticipated. Harper called Marjorie Collins. My parents' faces shifted confusion first, then alarm as she walked to the stand. She held Freya's will in her hands, and when she explained the promise she'd made when she said Freya had chosen me if Orion could not, my mother's face drained of color. My father shook his head, muttering lies, but Harper handed the judge the notarized document. It was validated on the spot. The weight of it was undeniable, but the other side wasn't finished. My parents' lawyer rose with smug certainty and produced a printed email. He claimed it was from Orion sent years ago, granting them permission to care for Ivy and manage her affairs. The words were neat, formal, and cold. The judge studied it, but Harper leaned forward and requested a forensic review. She had already run the metadata. This was sent from an IP address belonging to the Kane's residence in Salem, not from Seattle, where Orion lived at the time. Gasps broke out in the gallery. My father's face hardened into stone. I thought it was over, that we had pulled away their last mask. But as the session drew to a close, the clerk rushed in with a fax still warm from the machine. It was from a law office in California. The words were blurred, but the meaning was clear. Orion was alive, and he was petitioning to restore his parental rights. He promised to appear. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. My heart lurched. The brother I'd mourned, the man I'd thought lost, was not only alive but about to walk back into the story at the very moment Ivy's future hung in the balance. Relief, dread, anger, and hope collided inside me in a single violent rush. If he truly came back, everything we'd fought for could collapse, or it could finally set Ivy free. As the gavel struck to adjourn, I realized nothing was settled. My parents' lies were cracked wide open, but Orion's shadow now loomed over all of us. The truth was coming, and it would not wait. The courtroom buzzed with a restless silence, everyone sensing something was about to break. I sat at the petitioner's table, my palms damp against the wood, Harper steady beside me. The bailiff opened the side door, and in walked Orion. My breath caught. He was thinner than I remembered, his hair streaked with gray, though he was only a year younger than me. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of years pressed them down, but his eyes, those familiar eyes, still carried the sharpness of the boy I'd once protected. The room fell quiet enough to hear the shuffle of his shoes on the floor. Ivy froze where she sat with the guardian ad litem, her little hand gripping the stuffed bear until its seams strained. When she recognized him, her eyes went wide. She didn't run to him. She didn't look away either. She simply clung tighter to that bear, caught between longing and fear. My heart tore open at the sight. Orion took the stand. His voice was hoarse, but his words came clear. He admitted to everything I already knew and the things I feared, the drinking, the pills, the years when grief had left him incapable of being a father. He confessed to leaving Ivy with our parents because he thought they would do better than he could. Then he lifted his chin, forcing himself to look at the judge. He said he had been sober for over a year, that he was running a small software company in California, that he was ready to reclaim his role as Ivy's father. He wanted custody back. The judge asked if I had questions. I stood slowly, every eye in the room on me. "Do you know," I asked, my voice breaking, "what our parents have done to your daughter? Do you know she was locked in a storage room starving while they spent her allowance on concerts and restaurants?" Orion's eyes filled, his jaw trembling. He shook his head. "They told me she was fine," he whispered. "They said she was thriving. They said you were too busy to care, that you wanted her trust fund. They told me not to talk to you." I felt the ground tilt. He had believed them. And then in front of everyone, he said the words that cut me to the core. "My father sent me an email warning me not to trust you. He said you wanted Ivy's money, not Ivy." Gasps rippled through the gallery. My father stiffened his face, a mask of denial. Harper leaned forward, her voice precise as a scalpel. She produced the metadata report showing the email had been sent from my parents' home IP address, not from Seattle, where Orion had been at the time. The judge's eyes darkened. My mother began to sob, her tissue trembling in her hand. The thrum of justice was finally audible, like a drumbeat building in the room. But the true climax came when Ivy stood. Her knees shook, her voice so soft the bailiff had to ask her to repeat it. "I don't want to live with Grandma and Grandpa," she said. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch forever, she turned toward Orion. "I don't want you to go away again." I just want to be safe." Every voice in the courtroom fell silent. My brother's face crumpled. He covered his eyes with his hand, tears slipping through his fingers. I wrapped my arm around Ivy, steadying her trembling body as she buried her face into my shirt. I realized then that no matter what the law decided, her words had already drawn the line. She had spoken the truth none of us could ignore. I looked across at Orion, at the brother I had once carried on my back through wheat fields, the man who had disappeared into addiction and left me to pick up his broken pieces. For the first time in years, his eyes met mine, not with defiance, but with something closer to surrender. The gavel struck, adjourning until the following morning for the judge's ruling. I left the courthouse with Ivy's small hand in mine, the storm of the past crashing against the fragile hope of what lay ahead. The next morning, the courthouse air felt heavier, as though everyone knew the verdict would redraw our family forever. I sat straight-backed, Ivy nestled beside me with her guardian Harper poised with her notes. Across the aisle, my parents looked brittle, their lawyer whispering with increasing agitation. Orion sat alone, his head bowed, hands clasped tightly. Judge Holt entered, his expression grave. When he spoke, every syllable carried the weight of finality. After careful review of testimony, medical reports, financial evidence, and legal documents, this court finds Harlan and Lila Kane unfit for guardianship. Their rights are hereby terminated, and the matter will be referred to Child Protective Services for further oversight. My mother let out a sob muffled into her hands. My father's face froze as if stone had taken the place of flesh. The gallery murmured, some with pity, most with disapproval. Their fall from grace was complete. Then the judge turned to me. He held up Freya's notarized will. This document names Silas Kane as the secondary guardian in the event Orion Kane is unable to serve. Based on the evidence presented, the court awards full custody of Ivy to Silas Kane. He has demonstrated the capacity, stability, and commitment necessary to protect and nurture this child. My chest filled with a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I turned to Ivy, who looked up at me with wide eyes. For the first time, I allowed myself to smile. The judge wasn't finished. He turned to Orion. "You remain Ivy's biological father. The court recognizes your efforts toward sobriety and rehabilitation. You will be granted supervised visitation with the possibility of expanding those rights if you can demonstrate consistent stability and continued sobriety." Orion nodded, tears streaming unchecked down his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered, though I knew those words weren't for the judge alone. My parents tried one last time. Lila reached her hand toward Ivy, crying out, "Please forgive us, darling." But Ivy pulled closer to me, her little frame trembling, her silence a final verdict all her own. The bailiff guided my parents out, their heads low, their reputations in shreds. Salem would not forget. When the courtroom emptied, Orion approached me. He stood there shaking and finally said, "I failed her. I failed you. But you carried her when I couldn't. You were the father she needed." I swallowed hard. "You still have a chance," I said quietly, "but don't ever vanish again." Ivy hesitated, then gave him a small hug, tentative but real. Orion broke down, clutching her gently, promising he would fight to stay present. Back in Portland, weeks later, life began to take shape again. Ivy shared a room with Milo, who taught her to shoot hoops in the backyard. Sienna baked her cookies shaped like stars. The color returned to her cheeks, the shadows beneath her eyes softened. One morning, as we sat under the apple tree Sienna had planted years ago, I watched Ivy laugh as blossoms fell in her hair. The tree was blooming for the first time, and it felt like a sign that something broken had begun to mend. A letter arrived not long after. Inside was a check from Orion made out for a staggering amount. The note with it read, "This isn't repayment. It's gratitude. You saved her life." I folded it carefully and put it aside, vowing it would serve Ivy's future, not my own. Now, when I look back, I know this story was never just about custody battles or trust funds. It was about the meaning of family, what it asks of you, what it takes to fight for it, and how love sometimes demands you stand against your own blood. Responsibility, not DNA, makes someone a parent, and when the time came to choose, I chose Ivy. So here's what I tell anyone willing to listen. Trust your instincts, act when something feels wrong, and never underestimate the cost of silence. A child's safety outweighs pride, reputation, or money. That stormy night taught me one truth I'll never forget: family is not who claims you. It's who shows up when you're locked away in the dark, waiting for someone to turn the key.